There is a question about money that most people never ask themselves. Not how much they earn, not how much they save, not even how much they invest. The question is much more uncomfortable. Who do you believe you are when it comes to money? Maybe you're the responsible one, the person who never takes unnecessary risks. Maybe you're the hard worker, the person who believes that earning more is always the answer. Maybe you're the person who says, "I'm just not good with money." Or perhaps, "People like me don't become wealthy." These sound like harmless descriptions, but they may be something much more powerful. They may be identities. And once an idea becomes part of your identity, you stop evaluating it. You simply act from it. You don't ask whether it's still true. You ask what someone like you would normally do. And that is where the invisible pattern begins. Sometimes the financial life you're trying to change is being protected by the identity you're trying to preserve. What if the biggest financial limitation in your life is not your income, but the person you believe you have to remain? And what makes this dangerous is that you may have never consciously chosen that person. Think about how strange this is. Two people can have the same income, the same opportunities, even the same amount of money. And yet, one consistently builds wealth while the other consistently finds reasons not to. We usually look for the difference in knowledge, but sometimes the difference is deeper. One person thinks, "I'm someone who builds assets." The other thinks, "I'm someone who works hard for my money." Those two identities can produce completely different lives. And here's the disturbing part. The person with the second identity may genuinely believe they are doing everything right, because from inside the identity, their behavior makes perfect sense. This is one reason the ideas of thinkers like Daniel Kahneman are so relevant to money. Our minds don't simply calculate reality, they use mental shortcuts. And once a belief becomes deeply familiar, we tend to process new information through it. Charlie Munger emphasized the importance of recognizing the mental models that influence our decisions. Nassim Taleb warned us about the dangers of confusing what feels obvious with what is actually true. You cannot consistently change your financial behavior without eventually confronting the story you have about yourself. So let's examine 7 ways an invisible identity can quietly control your financial life. The first problem is simple. When you've lived with an identity long enough, it stops feeling like an identity. It starts feeling like reality. Imagine someone who has spent 20 years saying, "I'm terrible with investments." Eventually, they stop treating that sentence as an opinion. It becomes a fact. So when investing becomes complicated, they don't think, "I need to learn this." They think, "See, this is why investing isn't for me." The evidence seems to confirm the identity. But the identity created the behavior, and the behavior created the evidence. That's a closed loop, and once you're inside it, you may not even notice that you're inside it. But where did the identity come from in the first place? This is where things get interesting. Most limiting identities didn't begin as limitations. They began as solutions. Maybe your family struggled financially, so you learned to avoid risk. Maybe money was always scarce, so spending became emotionally difficult. Maybe you watched your parents work relentlessly, so you learned security comes from working harder. Maybe you were rewarded for being responsible, so you became the person who never makes mistakes. At some point, these behaviors protected you. And that's important, because the goal isn't to blame your past. The goal is to understand it. A strategy that protected you at 20 may limit you at 45. A belief that helped you survive may prevent you from building. The problem isn't that the identity was irrational. The problem is that it may have expired. And this leads to a dangerous question. What if the person you became to survive is not the person you need to become to prosper? Most people spend their lives working for money, but very few ever learn the rules that build wealth. Wealth Compass.
Understanding the hidden rules of wealth.
Once an identity becomes established, your mind has a reason to protect it. Because changing the identity creates uncertainty. And uncertainty feels dangerous. Imagine you have always been the cautious person. Someone tells you about a sensible long-term investment. You immediately notice the risks. Someone else points out the potential benefits. But your attention keeps returning to what could go wrong. You may call this financial prudence. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's identity protection. Because if you accept that calculated risk can be appropriate, you have to reconsider the person you've always believed yourself to be. And that is psychologically expensive, so the brain finds another solution. It gives you reasons to stay the same. Now isn't the right time. The market is too uncertain. I'll do it when I know more. I'm just being responsible. Sometimes those statements are correct. But sometimes they are sophisticated excuses protecting a familiar identity. And if you want to know which one it is, watch what happens when the opportunity disappears. Does your regret come from losing money or from losing the chance to become someone different? Because identity doesn't just influence what you decide. It influences what you even notice, and that changes everything. Two people can look at the exact same financial situation and see completely different realities. A person who identifies as a consumer notices what they can afford. A person who identifies as an investor notices what they can own. A person who identifies as an employee notices salary opportunities. A person who identifies as an owner notices systems, assets, and leverage. Same world, different attention, and attention determines what information reaches your decision-making process. This is why simply telling someone, learn more about money is often not enough. If their identity says, investing is for people smarter than me, they may read every page looking for confirmation. The problem isn't information, the problem is the filter. And once you recognize the filter, you can finally see something you've been missing. Your financial world may be smaller than reality because your identity decides what belongs inside it. This is where the invisible pattern becomes almost impossible to detect. Behavior repeated long enough becomes a habit. Habits repeated long enough become evidence. Evidence repeated long enough becomes a story, and the story becomes identity. Consider someone who repeatedly says, I'll start investing next year. 1 year becomes 2, 2 becomes 5. Eventually, they don't see themselves as someone who hasn't invested yet. They see themselves as, I'm just not an investor. Notice what happened. A temporary behavior became a permanent description of the self. This is why identity can be more powerful than goals. A goal says, I want to become wealthy. Identity says, this is what someone like me does. The second statement reaches deeper. Because people don't like acting against their own self-image. If your behavior conflicts with your identity, you experience friction. And eventually, one of them usually changes. Most people change the behavior back because changing the identity feels harder. And that brings us to the most important part. If identity protects familiar behavior, what happens when you try to change? You may discover something very strange. Suppose you've spent decades being the person who plays it safe. Then one day, you decide to become more intentional with your money. You create an investment plan. You start questioning lifestyle inflation. You stop spending simply to maintain appearances. You begin thinking about ownership instead of consumption. Logically, this should feel empowering. But emotionally, it can feel uncomfortable. Why? Because you're not simply changing financial behaviors. You're changing the definition of yourself. And people often underestimate how much psychological resistance comes from that. The person who always worked hard may feel guilty about slowing down. The person who always saved may feel irresponsible when investing. The person who always spent to prove success may feel strangely invisible when they stop. The person who always lived paycheck to paycheck may feel uncomfortable when they finally have surplus. Even positive change can feel wrong when it contradicts who you've been. And this explains something important. Resistance doesn't always mean you're making a wrong decision. Sometimes, resistance is simply the old identity realizing it may no longer be needed. You are evolving beyond the patterns of the past. So how do you discover an identity you never questioned? Don't start with what you say, start with what you repeatedly do. Look at your financial decisions over the last few years. Not the exceptional decisions, the repeated ones. Where does your money consistently go? What financial decisions do you repeatedly postpone? What opportunities do you repeatedly reject? What risks do you consistently exaggerate? What risks do you consistently ignore? What do you repeatedly tell yourself about money? I'm not good with numbers. I need to enjoy life now. I'll worry about retirement later. I need a higher income first. Investing is too risky. People like me don't get rich. Now ask the question that changes everything. What kind of person would naturally behave this way? Don't judge the answer, observe it, because repetition leaves fingerprints. And your financial behavior may reveal an identity you never consciously chose. Here's the deeper lesson. Most people try to change their financial lives from the outside. They change budgets, they change investments, they change income, they change spending, and these things matter. But eventually they collide with something deeper, the internal model of who they are. Because you can give someone a better financial strategy and they can still sabotage it. Not because they're incapable, but because the strategy contradicts their identity. That's why lasting change often begins with a different question. Not, what should I do with my money? But, who would I have to become to consistently do those things? Maybe you need to become someone who thinks long-term. Someone who can tolerate uncertainty. Someone who values ownership more than appearance. Someone who doesn't need every purchase to prove success. Someone who sees money as a system rather than a score. And that doesn't mean pretending to be someone you're not. It means questioning whether the identity you're protecting still deserves your loyalty. There is something almost unsettling about self-awareness. Once you see a pattern, you can't completely unsee it. Once you realize that some of your financial decisions are connected to an old identity, you start noticing the connection everywhere. The purchase, the hesitation, the excuse, the opportunity you avoided, the risk you took, the lifestyle you defended. And suddenly, your financial life starts telling a different story. Not a story about money, a story about you. Maybe the person you call me is partly made from decisions you made years ago. Decisions made by a younger version of you with different information, different fears, different priorities, and a completely different horizon. Yet you may still be obeying those decisions today. That's the identity you never questioned. And perhaps the most important financial question isn't, how much wealth can I build? Perhaps it is, what version of myself am I still protecting, even though I have already outgrown it? Because wealth is not only about accumulating more. Sometimes, it begins with becoming free from the invisible rules you never realized you were following. If this video made you question a financial pattern you've carried for years, don't just watch the next video. Watch yourself. Notice the decisions you repeat. Notice the excuses that sound reasonable, and especially, notice the things you say, "That's just who I am." Because sometimes, that's exactly where the hidden pattern is. And if you want to keep uncovering the financial rules operating beneath the surface, subscribe to Wealth Compass. Because the biggest financial advantage is often seeing what others ignore. And here's something to think about before you leave. The identity controlling your money may not be the one you think. Because there is another identity, even deeper than this one. The identity you became because you believed you had no other choice. And that is where the next pattern begins.